Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you about the importance of evidence. And before you completely get turned off and decide to shift away from this video, please hear me out. The use of evidence is absolutely critical to what's going on in our society right now. For 47 years, I was a college professor, and I spent an inordinate amount of time talking to my students in classes on argumentation and persuasion, trying to convince them over and over again of the importance of evidence, but not just using any evidence, but how to determine credible evidence, and that all assertions and claims need to be backed up and supported by credible evidence. Generally, what we're seeing here, and it's not just from the Trump administration or the MAGA folks, etc., although they certainly are a problem, but across the media, what I am finding over and over again is an extremely poor use of evidence, if evidence is even cited. In many cases, it's not even cited. Let me just give you a few examples. Elon Musk contributed $290 million to the Trump campaign in the 2024 election. In the media presentations where I hear this statistic used over and over again by pundits and members of the news media, etc., it is just automatically assumed that $200 million that Musk contributed to the Trump campaign must have been very effective in putting Trump over the top and causing his reelection in 2024. No evidence is done, no scientific evidence is presented to show that $290 million made any effect whatsoever. But let me leave you with a comparison of these statistics. The Harris campaign in total spent $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion on her campaign. The Trump administration and the Trump campaign spent $1.09 billion. So Harris spent almost $500 million more than Trump, even including the $290 million from Musk. So how do we deduce that the $290 million from Musk had a deciding factor in the Trump reelection when Harris so massively outspent the whole Trump campaign? There just isn't any evidence to demonstrate that. But here's another interesting comparison. The Trump campaign spent $20 million on transgender ads. They showed these ads 55,000 times in battleground states. 55,000 times in battleground states. It's just assumed in the media, over and over again, I've seen it, where they just assumed that these had some big impact in the battleground states in which these ads were presented. Was there any scientific evidence to show this? No. Nobody ever presents any evidence, but ground media actually did a scientific study of these ads' effectiveness. And after doing a very careful scientific study of what was the possible effect of these ads, what they concluded is that it had no shift in voter preference, despite the fact that they were presented 55,000 times. That's the scientific evidence. But we just assume, especially in the media, that if you show an ad that many times and you spent $20 million on an ad, it must have had some impact. That is old thinking. That is archaic thinking, that somehow by presenting ads on television especially, or even digital ads, that they're automatically going to shift people's voter preferences. We don't have evidence to show that. So now let's talk about Donald Trump's use or non-use of evidence, which I think is, by anybody's estimation, is deplorable. In most cases, he doesn't provide any evidence for his claims. He just wildly asserts things. But oftentimes he will throw out statistics, and his use of statistics is just unbelievably bad. Let me just give you some very quick examples. On immigration, at various times during his campaign, and also during the 4 years where he was campaigning for re-election, and even during his first term, he kept citing statistics about the number of illegal immigrants in the United States. And he would say, well, there were 10 million illegal immigrants. Or he would say, well, no, there were 13 million. And then another time he would say, no, wait, it was 15 million. And then, no, it was 20 million. Or nope, it was probably 25 million. He never lands on a particular number, and he never cites a source. any kind of credible source, or any source at all, for any of these statistics. More recently, he just said in the last week at a Republican dinner that he was lowering drug prices. There's no evidence to show that. In fact, if anything, it looks like the drug prices are going to go up, especially with tariffs, etc. But here's what he said at that dinner, and this is a direct quote. We're going to get the drug prices down, not 30 or 40%, not 50 or 60%. No, we're going to get them down 1,000%, 600%, 500%, 1,500%. Numbers that are not even thought to be achievable. Duh, they aren't achievable. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that he goes from, like 500 to 600. He doesn't go in sequence. He jumps back and forth and around. Now, here's the thing, and anybody with a grade school education in an arithmetic knows that those statistics are absolutely absurd. If you drop drug prices by 100%, the drugs are free. If you drop drug prices by 1,500%, when you go to the pharmacist, they're going to give you a big wad of cash because this is a negative number. So instead of paying for the drugs, you're actually getting a rebate, a huge rebate if it's 1,500%. Notice he just makes up those statistics. He has no idea what he's even talking about. He doesn't even have a grade school understanding of arithmetic. Then there's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which just announced here in the last couple of days that they were making an adjustment in the May and June number of jobs that were created, and they dropped the total numbers by 258,000 fewer jobs in May and June than they had previously announced. And of course, this has created a huge brouhaha. People are asking, okay, why the 258,000 adjustment, and isn't this politicized? And then, of course, Trump's reaction was to fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because he didn't like the statistics. What people keep asking is, how can you drop the adjustment by 258,000 jobs from one month to the next? Well, here's a very brief explanation. Number one, the way that these numbers are computed is through surveys. And typically the BLS surveys about 560,000 businesses, large and small. What happens is that each month, only about 75% on average actually turn in those results of how many jobs they've either gained or lost on time. So the BLS has to make an estimate based on 75% return rate of how many jobs were created or lost in a particular month. But ever since 1940, when the BLS has been compiling these statistics, they've always made an adjustment for 2 months afterwards. And the reason for that is that these reports of the remaining 25% haven't come in until the next month, or in some cases 2 months later. And part of the reason for that is that there is great chaos in our economy right now, for instance, with the immigration raids and with the uncertainty associated with tariffs. And so businesses are waiting to turn in these reports because they're not sure whether they're going to hire, whether they're going to fire. And so they're kind of waiting and turning in the reports, in some cases weeks or even a month or more later. What happens is that 2 months down the line, the BLS then makes an adjustment and says, on the basis of about 95% return rate of these surveys, here's what we know about how many jobs were either gained or lost in particular months. And that is the explanation for it. So they're not just making them up, they're making their best educated estimates. Why don't they wait 3 months? Well, that would mean then the Federal Reserve System would have to make their decision about either raising or lowering interest rates on the basis of historical data instead of current data. So they go on the basis of the best estimates of the data available in order to be current. That's basically what it amounts to. Same thing with the stock market. Stock markets would be in complete chaos if you had to wait 3 months to find out what the actual statistics are. So they go on the basis of the best estimates. And most of the time, the BLS, the estimates are pretty close. Once in a while, like the recent one, there is a pretty large change. give you another example of the Trump administration's use of evidence, which makes absolutely no sense. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced, for instance, in a big media presentation, that the federal government had seized 22 million fentanyl pills in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. And then she concluded, and this is really amazing, she concluded that because they had seized 22 million fentanyl pills, that Trump administration had actually saved 119 million Americans from death. She just assumed, for instance, that 22 million fentanyl pills were going to be used and somehow came up with 119 million Americans. But it got worse. She then decided that that wasn't a big enough number, so the next day at a cabinet meeting, she said, no, wait, Trump administration actually saved 258 million lives, not 119 million lives. Which means that if you do just some simple arithmetic, that means that for every pill, every fentanyl pill that they had seized, there would have had to have been 12 people using each one of those pills. So they had to divide it into a 12th. How that would be a deadly dose, she never bothers to explain. She assumes apparently that 258 million people are on illicit drugs, which is absurd because the federal government has repeatedly determined that only about 11% of American adults actually take illicit drugs of any kind, not just fentanyl. And total overdoses of illicit drugs from 2024 amounted to 75,000 overdose deaths. So the statistics make absolutely no sense. The Trump administration and the media use or non-use of evidence is absolutely deplorable and massively distorts our reality and our ability to make wise decisions. And that, I think, is absolutely critical.